12 board members and the company's senior leadership sat around that table in complete silence, and every single one of them was looking at me. Not at my director, not at his son, at me. Like I was the problem. Like I was the one who had just tried to blow up a 30-year reputation over a grudge. My director leaned back in his chair at the head of the table and said it again, slower this time, like he was talking to someone who hadn't understood the first time. I'm asking you to apologize to my son right now, in front of everyone here, or you can clean out your office before lunch. I had 22 years with that company. I started as a site inspector straight out of the Canadian Forces, checking structural welds on bridge contracts in Northern Ontario before I even knew what a project manager was. I worked my way up through every rung there was: field supervisor, quality lead, regional compliance officer, and finally senior contracts manager. I had never once been asked to apologize for doing my job correctly. I looked at his son across the table, 28 years old, brought into the company 14 months ago with the title of Operations Development Lead, a title that, as far as I could tell, nobody had held before him and nobody had asked for. He was looking at his phone. I thought about the folder on my laptop. I thought about the recording on my phone. I thought about the 16 months I had spent watching this play out, waiting for this exact moment. Give me 1 second, I said. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. I should explain who I am and how I got there, because none of what happened makes sense without it. My name is Owen. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, in a family where nobody went to university. My father drove transit for 30 years. My mother worked the counter at a pharmacy on Notre Dame. When I finished high school, I enlisted, spent 8 years in the Canadian Armed Forces as a combat engineer, did 2 tours, and came back with a very specific skill set. I knew how things were built, I knew how they failed, and I knew how to document both. I joined Dunmore Infrastructure Group in 2003. Dunmore was a mid-sized civil engineering and construction management firm based in Hamilton, with contracts across Ontario, Manitoba, and occasionally the federal government. Good company. The kind of place where if you showed up and did the work, people noticed. By 2019, I was managing a portfolio of contracts worth just under $80 million. Municipal water infrastructure upgrades, highway overpasses, a few federal buildings. My director was a man named Gerald Whitfield, who had been with Dunmore for 26 years, and who, before his son arrived, I had genuinely respected. Gerald was old school in the best way. He believed in specs. He believed in documentation. He used to say that a contract was a promise, and that a broken promise in construction didn't cost you a meeting. It cost someone a ceiling, a wall, a bridge. I had worked under him for 9 years, and I had never once seen him cut a corner. Then his son showed up. Liam Whitfield arrived in February of 2022 with an MBA from Western, a handshake from his father, and 0 days of field experience. Gerald introduced him at a company-wide meeting as a strategic asset who would be helping modernize Dunmore's operations. Nobody said anything because Gerald was a VP and it was his company too, in a sense. But I noticed the way the project engineers in my department looked at each other when Liam started talking about efficiency frameworks and procurement optimization. In construction, optimization usually means one thing. You're about to use cheaper materials. At first, Liam was more or less harmless. He sat in on meetings, asked questions that showed he didn't fully understand what we did, and wrote reports that Gerald would circulate with comments like, "interesting perspective," and nothing else. I stayed out of his way. It wasn't my fight. That changed in March of 2023 when Gerald assigned Liam to co-lead the bid preparation for the Northgate Municipal Water Renewal Project, a $47 million contract with the city of Hamilton to replace aging water mains across a 12-kilometer stretch of the lower city. It was the biggest single contract Dunmore had bid on in 5 years. I was assigned to lead technical specifications. Liam was assigned to lead cost analysis. I remember thinking, at the time, that this was a strange arrangement. Cost analysis and technical specifications are not separate tracks on a project like this. Every materials decision has a spec implication, and every spec decision has a cost implication. Putting 2 people in charge of those 2 things without a clear escalation process was either a mistake or it was deliberate. I found out pretty quickly which one it was. The Northgate project had strict materials requirements. Municipal water infrastructure in Ontario is governed by provincial standards, and the City of Hamilton had added their own specifications on top of those: pipe grade, joint type, bedding material, corrosion protection. These weren't suggestions. They were contractual obligations. If we won the bid and then used materials that didn't meet those specs, we would be in breach of contract, subject to remediation costs, liable for any downstream failures, and potentially flagged with the Ontario Construction Secretariat, which would affect our ability to bid future provincial work. I had built our materials list carefully. Class 52 ductile iron pipe, polyethylene encasement, specific joint restraint systems from 2 approved Canadian suppliers. The cost per linear meter was higher than commodity alternatives, but it was what the contract required, and it was what the city expected. In early April, I sent my full specifications package to Liam for integration into the cost model. He sent back a revised version 10 days later. The pipe specification had been changed. Not dramatically, not obviously. If you weren't looking for it, you might not catch it. But it had been changed from Class 52 ductile iron to a lighter Class 50, and the joint restraint system had been swapped for a model that was not on the city's approved supplier list. The cost difference across the full project was roughly $340,000, which sounds like a lot until you understand that $340,000 on a $47 million project is less than 1%, and that the risk of using off-spec materials on a municipal water contract could expose Dunmore to liability that would make $340,000 look like change on the sidewalk. I flagged it immediately. I sent Liam an email laying out the specific spec deviations, the relevant sections of the Hamilton contract documents, and the provincial standards that applied. I was polite. I explained the risk. I asked him to revert to the original specifications. He wrote back 2 days later and said the changes had been reviewed and approved at the director level, and that if I had concerns, I should raise them directly with Gerald. So I did. Gerald's response surprised me. He said that the cost analysis team had identified a material substitution that was functionally equivalent, and that the city wouldn't be likely to catch the difference during routine inspection. He said the project was already coming in tight on margin and that this was a reasonable business decision. He told me to update my specifications accordingly. I sat with that conversation for a long time. I had never heard Gerald talk like that. Functionally equivalent, wouldn't catch the difference. These are not phrases that belong in a conversation about public water infrastructure. These are phrases that belong in a conversation about cutting corners on a project where someone else pays the price if things go wrong. I updated my specifications, but I kept my original version, and I started keeping notes. What I didn't fully understand yet was how far this had already gone. Over the following 3 months, as the Northgate bid was finalized and submitted, I began to notice other things. Material substitutions on 2 smaller projects that were already under construction. A bridge deck rehabilitation job in Stony Creek with a specified polymer-modified asphalt had been quietly swapped for a standard mix. A municipal building retrofit in Brantford where the fire-rated drywall spec had been downgraded. Small changes, each one explainable in isolation, each one saving Dunmore somewhere between $15,000 and $80,000. I kept notes on all of it. In September of 2023, Dunmore was awarded the Northgate contract. There was a company celebration. Gerald sent around a congratulatory email. Liam was mentioned by name. 3 weeks after the award, I was reviewing the procurement schedule, and I noticed that the pipe order had gone out to a supplier I didn't recognize, not one of the 2 approved suppliers I had specified, and not the revised specification Liam had pushed through either. It was a third option, cheaper still, and further still from what the city had contracted for. I went back through the project file. Someone had made a change to the material schedule after the contract was awarded. The change wasn't documented in the project changelog. There was no approval trail. That night, I sat in my car in the Dunmore parking lot for about 20 minutes before I drove home. I thought about what I was looking at. I thought about what happens when off-spec water main pipe fails. Not immediately, usually, but 5 years down the road, 10 years, when the joints start to leak and the corrosion protection degrades and someone's basement floods or a sinkhole opens up on a residential street. I thought about who would be on the hook when that happened, and whether Dunmore would even still be around to answer for it. I drove home and I called a lawyer friend of mine, a guy I had known since high school who now practiced civil litigation in Mississauga. I didn't give him specifics. I just asked him generally what happens when a construction firm uses materials that don't match what a municipal contract specifies. He said it depends on whether it was a mistake or deliberate. If it was deliberate, he said, you're not just talking about breach of contract, you're potentially talking about fraud. I thanked him and hung up. The next morning, I started documenting everything. I am not a dramatic person by nature. I don't make recordings of conversations. I don't save emails in separate folders. I don't build files on people. That is not how I have operated in 22 years with this company or at any other point in my life. But I'm an engineer by training and a soldier by background, and both of those things taught me the same lesson. When something is going wrong, you document it. You create a paper trail. You preserve the record, not because you're planning to use it, but because if things deteriorate to the point where you need it, you will be very glad it exists. By October of 2023, I had a comprehensive file, emails, specification comparisons with the contract documents, photographs I had taken during site visits showing materials that didn't match the approved specs, procurement records I had pulled through my authorized access to the project management system, and recordings, legal in Ontario, where only one party to a conversation needs to consent to recording, meaning I could record any conversation I was part of. I had recorded 4 conversations with Liam and 2 with Gerald. In those recordings, Liam referred to the spec changes as margin of recovery. In one of them, he laughed about the city inspector being not technical enough to know the difference. Gerald, in his recording, told me that I was overthinking the risk profile and that my job was to deliver the project, not to second-guess the business strategy. I had everything. What I didn't have was a plan, because going to Gerald was obviously not an option. Going above Gerald meant going to the CEO, a man named Wallace Keane, who I didn't know well and who might or might not be aware of what was happening. Going outside the company meant going to the city of Hamilton, or to the Ontario Construction Secretariat, or potentially to a lawyer, all of which would end my career at Dunmore regardless of the outcome. So I waited. I kept doing my job. I kept documenting, and I waited for the situation to come to a head on its own, which I suspected it would. It did, just not in the way I expected. In January of 2024, Liam made a mistake. He had been expanding his influence gradually, sitting in on project reviews he hadn't been invited to, sending directives to junior staff that hadn't gone through proper channels, starting to act as though his father's title was his own. Most people were too nervous about Gerald to push back. I stayed quiet and kept notes. The mistake was this. Liam sent an email to 3 of our subcontractors on the Northgate project, instructing them to use the substituted pipe material and to record it in their site logs using the original spec designation, Class 52, even though what was actually going in the ground was not Class 52. This is not a gray area. This is falsifying construction records on a municipal contract. This is fraud. One of those subcontractors, a small family operation out of Burlington that had been working with Dunmore for 12 years, forwarded the email to me. The owner's name was Phil Desjardins, and he told me quietly over the phone that he wasn't comfortable with what was being asked of him and that he thought I should know about it. I thanked Phil. I told him to keep a copy of the email and not to respond to Liam directly. I told him I would handle it. I added his email to my file. 2 days later, I sent a carefully worded internal memo to Gerald, flagging what I called a documentation inconsistency in the Northgate materials, records, and requesting a meeting to clarify the recording protocol. I didn't mention Liam. I didn't mention fraud. I just flagged the inconsistency and asked for guidance. Gerald didn't respond to my memo. What he did, 4 days later, was call a meeting. The meeting was on a Thursday morning in late January. Gerald had booked the main boardroom, not his office, the boardroom. And when I arrived, I found 12 members of the company's leadership sitting around the table. Project directors, the CFO, the head of HR, Wallace Keene, the CEO, at the far end, and Liam, sitting to his father's right, still looking at his phone. I understood immediately that this was not the meeting I had requested. Gerald opened by saying that he had received my memo and that he wanted to address the concerns I had raised about project documentation. He said the company took its record-keeping obligations seriously. He said, and this is the part I will never forget, that it had come to his attention that I had been creating an atmosphere of distrust within my team by questioning decisions that had been made at the director level, and that this kind of insubordination had a corrosive effect on company culture. Then he said that his son had been unfairly targeted by my concerns, and that he expected me to acknowledge that, publicly, in front of the people in this room. I looked at Wallace Keene. He was looking at the table. I looked at the head of HR. She was looking at her notepad. I looked at Liam. He had finally put down his phone. Gerald said, "Owen, this is the moment where you decide what kind of person you are and what kind of future you have at this company." I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. I said, "Before I respond to any of that, I need to share something with everyone in this room." Gerald said, "This isn't the time for." I connected my laptop to the boardroom display. I said, "This will take about 4 minutes. I'd ask everyone to please just watch." What came up on the screen was not a recording. It was a document, a side-by-side comparison of the Northgate contract specifications, the materials actually ordered, and the materials actually installed, with the relevant contract clauses highlighted. 3 columns, clearly labeled, sourced entirely from documents within Dunmore's own project management system. I let them look at it for about 15 seconds. Then I pulled up Phil Desjardins' email, Liam's instruction to subcontractors to falsify their site logs. I had redacted Phil's name. I said, "This email was sent from a Dunmore email address to 3 subcontractors on the Northgate project in January. I have the original with full headers." The room was very quiet. Then I opened an audio file. I said, "This is a recording of a conversation I had with Gerald on September 14, 2023 regarding the materials substitution on the Northgate project. I want to note that under Ontario law, recording a conversation you are party to is legal, and this recording was made lawfully." I pressed play. Gerald's voice came through the boardroom speakers, clear and unhesitating. "The city inspector isn't going to run a materials test on every pipe joint. That's not how it works. Your job is to deliver the project." I let it finish. Then I said, "I have a second recording, and I have a complete documentation file. Specifications, procurement records, site photographs, and correspondence that I submitted to a lawyer yesterday morning and that has been provided to the City of Hamilton's Contracts Compliance Office as of this morning." I looked at Gerald. He had aged about 10 years in the last 4 minutes. I said, "I'm not going to apologize, but I would like the opportunity to discuss what happens next in an appropriate setting with HR and legal present." Wallace Keene spoke for the first time. He said, "Gerald, Liam, please wait outside." What happened next took several months and was not as simple or clean as that boardroom moment made it feel. The City of Hamilton launched a formal compliance review of the Northgate project the following week. Dunmore voluntarily suspended work on the site pending inspection. The city's engineering consultants confirmed that the installed materials did not meet the contract specifications in several key areas. Dunmore was required to replace approximately 2.3 kilometers of pipe at their own cost, a remediation that came in at just over $1.1 million. Gerald resigned within 2 weeks of the boardroom meeting. There was no announcement. One morning, his name was simply no longer on the company directory. Liam was terminated. I don't know exactly what was communicated to him. I wasn't in that room. The City of Hamilton referred the matter to the Ontario Construction Secretariat, which opened a compliance investigation. Dunmore's legal team cooperated fully. Based on what I was told through the process, no individual criminal charges were pursued, but the company entered into a compliance agreement with the Secretariat that included an independent audit of all active contracts and mandatory third-party oversight on any future municipal work. Phil Desjardins' company received a formal acknowledgement from Dunmore's CEO for coming forward. That was Wallace's idea, and I thought it was the right thing to do. The woman who had been taking notes on her pad at the boardroom table, the head of HR, whose name was Diane, came to my office the afternoon after the meeting and closed the door and said, "I want you to know that I had no idea how far this had gone." I believed her. I told her I did. I stayed with Dunmore. That surprises people when I tell them. They expect the story to end with me walking out the door with my head high, moving on to something better. But I had 22 years in that company. I had helped build it into what it was. The problem wasn't Dunmore. The problem was two people who had used Dunmore as a vehicle for something that had nothing to do with what the company stood for. Wallace promoted me to Director of Quality and Compliance 6 months after the boardroom meeting. New title, new mandate, direct reporting line to the CEO. My first task was to audit the documentation practices across every active project we had. My second task was to write a new internal policy for material substitution approvals, a policy that required written sign-off from both the technical lead and an independent compliance officer for any deviation from contracted specifications. I based the policy on what I'd learned over 2 years of watching how easy it was for one person with a title and a family connection to quietly undo 30 years of doing things right. I think about Gerald sometimes, not with anger. I got past that. I think about the version of him that I worked under for 9 years. The man who used to say that a contract was a promise. I wonder at what point he decided that his son's career was worth more than that. I wonder if he thought no one was paying attention or if he thought that even if someone noticed, they wouldn't say anything. I've spent a long time in fields where the work either holds or it doesn't, where the difference between a good weld and a bad one doesn't show up until something is under stress, where corners cut in a warm office show up as failures in the cold, years later, when the person cutting those corners is long gone and someone else is standing in the damage. I am 51 years old. I have been in this industry for more than half my life. I don't think of what I did as brave. I think of it as the only thing I could do and still look at myself in the mirror. The pipe is in the ground now. The right pipe. The kind that holds. That's enough for me. I've thought a lot about the moment Gerald looked across that boardroom table at me and decided that his son's comfort was worth more than 30 years of doing things right. Not because I'm still angry about it. I'm not, but because I think it tells you something true about how these situations actually unfold. They don't start with a dramatic decision to do wrong. They start with a small one. A single substitution. A quiet change to a material schedule. A conversation where someone tells themselves that the risk is manageable and the inspector won't notice and the margin justifies it. And then the next small decision is a little easier because the first one didn't cost anything. That's how it goes. What Gerald never counted on was that someone was paying attention. I didn't document everything because I was planning a confrontation. I documented it because I was trained over years to understand that the record is the only thing that survives when everything else falls apart. That's not cleverness. That's discipline. It's the kind of thinking you develop when you've spent time in environments where a failure to document can get someone hurt. I wasn't smarter than Gerald. I just hadn't stopped taking the work seriously. And Phil Desjardins, who ran a small crew out of Burlington and had been laying pipe for Dunmore for 12 years. Phil made the harder call than I did, in a way. He had more to lose and less protection. He called me because it was a right, and because he built something of his own, and he wasn't willing to put his name on falsified records to protect someone else's son. That kind of integrity doesn't announce itself. It just shows up when it's needed. I think about what I would tell a younger version of myself going into a situation like that. Not the tactics, the folder, the recordings, the lawyer call. Those are details. What I'd say is this: know what you stand for before you're tested on it, because when the moment comes, you will not have time to figure it out. Gerald knew, once, what he stood for. He just stopped standing there. That's the thing about character. It's not a fixed state. It's a choice you keep making or stop making under pressure. The pipe is in the ground now. Inspected, certified, meeting every specification the city of Hamilton contracted for. A few years from now, nobody walking on those streets will know it was ever in question. That's fine. That's how it should be. The work should hold without anyone having to know the story behind it. I stayed at Dunmore because the problem was never Dunmore. I stayed because walking away would have meant leaving something I helped build in the hands of whatever came next. And I wasn't willing to do that. Staying and fixing it. That felt more like the job. I'm 51 years old. I don't have a dramatic ending to offer. Just this: the things you build carefully, the records you keep honestly, the calls you make even when they're inconvenient. They add up. Not always visibly, not always quickly, but they hold. Same as good pipe.